first, a definition, a simpler definition. So it's simpler than, for instance, the framework that was discussed in the panel before the coffee break. It's simpler because we want to make it quite simple for people, including politicians, for instance, who think that digital sovereignty is just data sovereignty. So as long as you have the data that are on your territory, as long as you have data centers on your territory, you're safe and you are sovereign. It's not true. The main ingredient, in our opinion, is that that of technological autonomy. If you don't control, at least in large part, the technology, if you can switch provider, but also if you don't have a deep understanding and a deep mastery of the technology that you are using, you are not truly sovereign. So with open source, there were, as a pioneer of open source businesses in France, we've seen the market evolve, and we've seen the reason our customer switch or at least choose open source evolve over time. So 25 years ago, the main driver was cost. The open source was cheaper than proprietary alternative, and this was what moved the early adopters. Some early adopters, including for instance, in the French government, because that was my customers at the time, were already looking for something that we didn't call at the time digital sovereignty, but was very close to what is perceived today as digital sovereignty. But over the years, and starting, let's say, around 2010, the notion of innovation, of time to market, of collaboration became the most important part of the equation in terms of acceptance and adoption of open source by corporate and not corporate customers. So the three drivers, or six drivers that are listed in the slide: autonomy and reversibility, so that's the notion of interoperability, and of course the notion of having open source licenses for your source code. It means that you have the right to do what's needed in case you are losing some sort of autonomy. Collaboration and innovation, as I said, this was a main driver, and security and transparency, it is something that is very important. It has always been, but it's even more important nowadays. So what we did with the group, the 5-people group, we first started to identify the gaps. So we identified 5 critical gaps. I won't say weaknesses, because in the poll that has been organized by the Nexus Forum, I've seen that a question about is open source really so weak, and what do we need to do to address the weakness of open source? Open source in Europe is not weak. We have one of the strongest, if not the strongest, open source community in the world, for instance, in terms of number of developers. What is missing, maybe, is a strategy, and it is corporate adoption on the large scale. So what are the 5 gaps? So first one, the challenge of open washing. This is a battle that happened more than 15 years ago in the European Commission, and that was mostly lost by the proponent of open source. So between 2004 and 2009, there was the European Interoperability V1, or the first version, which was mandating the use of open standards with a strong definition of open standards. And open source was the natural solution to implement those open standards. But under extremely intense lobbying from Microsoft in particular, and more generally the US lobbies, the US tech companies' lobbies, the Commission changed its mind and adopted a much weaker definition, which put a halt on the progression of open source, at least, yes, at the time. The second point, which has been discussed many times, It's how do you finance the maintenance of open source. Many open source programs, not all of them, but many open source programs are created by volunteers or by people who have very little income from this open source work. So this can create vulnerabilities, and some of these vulnerabilities have been quite notable over the last years. This was discussed, for instance, at the 2021 or 22 workshop on open source sustainability, which happened in Brussels under the auspice of the Commission. But the conclusion, there was a lot of discussion, but there were, as far as I know, no definitive solution that were implemented following this very intense workshop. Market visibility, so open source solution, and that's also true in general for European solution, have much less visibility than the big tech solution, especially the three big cloud providers, or a few other like Oracle, Cisco, and VMware, and so on. So that's an issue, because our companies, the small, which are usually SMEs in Europe, most of the tech companies that are in the open source sector, for instance, in France, the association that I represent, we have around 300 members. Out of these 300 members, there are two companies that are larger than 500 employees. The rest is very small, much smaller, 100, 50, 20, 15. The average is around, I think, between 15 and 20. A skills deficit, so there is a skill deficit. Of course, for contributors, so because with more contributors, we would get much more interesting dynamics, but also for adoption within the companies and the public administration, for instance. And last, this has been discussed during the panel, governance and influence. Even if we have more developers in Europe, open source developers in Europe, the most powerful foundation, the Linux Foundation, is based in the US, and the most powerful foundation or governance structures are mostly influenced by bigger American companies. So what did we do with these 5 gaps? We created propositions, and we came up with a huge list of 70 propositions. So I won't have the time to discuss every one of them one by one. I must say that this proposition didn't come out of nowhere. With Apple, for instance, we've had yearly workshop where we discussed these many ideas, and all these ideas were written in various reports. Same with CNLS, same with OSBA, the German association. And in France and probably in other countries, there were also some members of parliament who did work on digital sovereignty or who did work on open source and wrote down proposals. So we used all these proposals to try to come up with a strategic plan and a list of proposals. So the first pillar, technological development, I will give you only four different propositions. Creation of what we called at the time an open source sovereignty fund. So the report was written at the beginning of the year, and was mostly discussed last year. There is now a proposition on the table, the EU STF by Open Forum Europe, which is quite similar to what we wrote down in the report. The question of defining what is a true open standard, opposable or enforceable open standard that I discussed when discussing the European interoperability framework, doing large-scale demos and reference implementation, and so on and so on. Regarding skills, well, many propositions. I think maybe it's one of the last, but one of the most important thing we could do for the future is to have our children or either in school or in the university or engineering school, to have a specific, at least some notion of open source at a very early age, and later, for those that are specializing in IT and computer science, more specific training about open source and how it works and how you can do business. Because in the university, open source is very often confused with an object that is purely intellectual, purely a research object. But it is also an industrial object that needs all the resources to be developed, to be used, and to be maintained. About public procurement. So there is a key phrase that has been discussed for at least 10 years. I don't remember the exact date it was started, but it's public money, public code. But what does exactly public money, public code mean? It means that when, for instance, the European Commission finances a company for creating code, it can be for a research project, or it can be for a custom development project, the code should be public. It's not always true, especially for research, but there is all the open science movement that moves into this direction. And for code that is custom developed for the public sector, at least in France and in several other countries, this is mandated by the law, for instance, in France since 2016, the Digital Republic Law. But what we ask more is a European open source priority for open source and a priority for European software. So this leads us to the criteria, and then a couple of other propositions, which are, for instance, to help the public procurement officers in the public administration or even in the private sector to understand what is open source and to create the conditions for open source companies to compete on a level field with the hyperscalers or with the American companies and so on. So, highlighting just one thing, what is European open source? This is a debate that many people have had in our community for at least 20 years. Is it meaningful to restrict ourselves to open source that is created in the Paris region, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Europe in general, or is open source a worldwide phenomenon, and so on? Well, there are some pros and cons. The pros, of course, is that with open source you have a license, and the license, as long as it is an open source or a free software license, it will give you the right to copy, to modify, to redistribute, and so on. You may think that you are clear, but you are not, because there are laws, there are American export restrictions, for instance, that could prevent you from exporting your software, even if it's open source, and so on. So we've added some criteria to try to define a little bit better, and it's in the report. You can read the details. Origin, governments, community, of course, the license. It should be the first criterion. In case it is a solution and not just a program, as we've discussed before, how the data are handled, and also how do you contribute to the European ecosystem. So this is the new motto. It's not just public money, public code. It's public money, public code, open source first, and European preference. At least that's what we suggest in the report. So let's move on to the last pillars. So growth and investment. So I think in terms of developing the market, I think maybe the first item should be branding. How do we expand the market share, and we mind share of open source in Europe, and how do we explain that open source made in Europe has qualities that are useful for the market. Investment, accelerators, etc. Then governments, as I said, this was discussed. There are many different issues under this this pillar. The idea, for instance, we have observed that the European Commission can pass laws and directives and regulation that can make the life harder for open source companies and not easier. For instance, with the CRA, for 2 years, we had to fight for a reasonably decent wording of the directive, because in the beginning, the directive was not taking into account the realities of open source businesses in Europe. There was an exception for open source in the CRA, but this only applied to non-commercial open source, and it wasn't defined nowhere. And we had to spend 2 years trying to have a reasonable definition. The problem is that for many people, including politicians, of course there are politicians who don't know what open source is at all, and there are those who think they know what it is, but they understand that open source is just digital commons. It's just people that are doing this after work, or foundation, nice foundation that are doing it for the public good. But it's more complicated. Of course, there are those people, and we are very happy that they exist. But some of the biggest foundations are, well, they are financed by large companies, and they work in the interest of those companies. And also there are all these European SMEs, open source SMEs, that have to be taken into account when the new laws and regulations are discussed. So the creation, for instance, of an advisory council with experts both from the community but also from the industry would probably help the Commission or any lawmaking organization to come up with better. Well. So what's almost the conclusion? I think you want me to conclude? Almost the conclusion. So in the end of the report, we highlight the transformative impact of open source in several sectors. Of course, there is maybe a little gray zone between what is really specific to open source and what is more general about IT transformation. But for public administration, transparency, security, and so on, for manufacturing, there are many open source solutions that can help with predictive maintenance and so on. Healthcare, we all know that there are very big issues with security in healthcare, and open source properly managed could help. And in terms of energy, the impact would be, of course, to better optimize the consumption of energy. This is, we are not trying just to convince the public sector to pass new rules and regulations, or to just change the public procurement policies and train their public procurement officer. We're also trying to convince everyone that it is in their best interest to adopt open source. So for private sector companies, we have 3 main drivers. I give you the slide. How to enhance growth and profitability through open source, or to reduce cost and risk, and how to improve innovation. That's not what I wrote in the slide, but that are 3 different ways to say the same things. So for Europe, with the proposals, maybe not the 70 proposals, but at least if Europe could adopt at least 10 of the 70 proposals we wrote down in the document, this would create a virtuous cycle of better sovereignty, more sovereign infrastructure, creating an ecosystem of SMEs and making it thrive, reducing the dependency on both foreign and technologies that you don't control, and having technologies used in Europe which are aligned with the European values. So this is a call to action. There are already actions that are more or less aligned with some of the ideas that we outlined or some of the propositions we wrote down in the paper. For instance, the cloud sovereignty framework that was discussed during the panel. which I find, maybe it's too late to discuss, to give my opinion, but yeah, so, sorry. The procurement initiative, including the upcoming procurement directive, the EU STF, so the European Sovereign Tech Fund that has been proposed by Open Forum Europe and that is been supported by many organizations already, but now we need the money. Without money, the fund can't exist. And a digital declaration of independence that we are going to publish in the next weeks. And if you want to sign it, you just have to contact me. So that's it. That's my conclusion.
Great insights and great timekeeping. Thank you. I believe we can allow ourselves for a really short question or two. So please, if you have a question, we have one there. Anyone else that would like to go in the question queue? You, okay.
Thank you, Stéfane. I agree with you on almost every point. It will come as no surprise to you that maybe I'm supporting some of the points more than others. And for me, one of the questions I really liked, for example, in the defining European open source, really emphasizing that a substantial amount or a portion of the contributor base should be based in Europe. Also recognizing companies that contribute to a European, yes, exactly, this one, contributes back to the ecosystem. And of course, the foundation should be the open source license. On the governance thing, I think that this is where we had sort of insisting on European governance. This is my question a little bit, because I am personally of the opinion that we need to convince European companies to actually contribute more to those foundations that you remember, that you mentioned. And what is stopping them right now from doing that? Those foundations are in a way have an open governance and are agnostic, I think, to where the money is coming from. And the fact is that they are mainly financed by US and Chinese big companies. But I'm always trying to say, why aren't European companies going there? Because they could also play an influential role in those foundations. And I think that we also need to look beyond some of the bigger players. I'm also a member of the board of the Drupal Association, which has its seat as a not-for-profit right now in the US. But if you go to DrupalCon in Vienna, for example...
So Chico, sorry, may we go to the point of the question?
Yes, the question is, what is stopping European companies right now from influencing those big open source foundations?
Well, I can speak for them, but what can observe is that the largest open source foundation is actually a large company. It's a 300 million euros or dollars per year turnover company. And you say open the governance, I say you have to pay a big ticket to enter even to become a member of this organization. So with CNLL, the entry ticket is 500 euros. With OW2, I think it's 500 euros or something, maybe 1,000 euros. With this organization and other, it's, I don't know, 10,000, 50,000, and so on. So there is a money issue. In open source, everyone will say there are many different kinds of issues, but there is this issue that this is very expensive, and not all the SMEs, especially the SMEs, can't participate for this reason. Now, for the large companies, I think it's a bit different. They want to... Well, large companies like to work with large organizations, so maybe they are happier than I am with this this scheme. But what we would really like to see is more European open source organization or open source foundation. We have OW2, which is not really... who knows OW2 in this room? Yeah, not that many. They have been around for more than 20 years. They are a small organization, 6, 7 people, managing a few tens or dozens of projects. The CEO of this organization is paid less than the minimal salary in France. So just to give you an idea. So yes, let's encourage more foundation-like organization in Europe, and then we can tell everyone to join them and to contribute.
Thank you very much, Stéfane. Huge round of applause. Thank you.